Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, there have been many questions about what ordinary Russians actually think. It's true that whilst a lot of Russians are pro-war, there are significant numbers of people who hold differing opinions, whether that means opposing it or simply being apathetic. Although, of course, the actual numbers are difficult to establish. Let's take a look at a couple of the main reasons for the high levels of support for and apathy towards the war in Ukraine among Russians. First, there's the role of propaganda. Remember what the world of the Ministry of Truth looked like in 1984? Well, Orwell's descriptions almost sound like a parody of the actual situation facing Russia today. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, several independent news channels sprang up, including NTV, one of the most powerful TV channels in the 90s. For a short time, Russia had a genuinely free press. However, almost immediately after Putin came into power in 2000, he started trying to control Russian TV. From that point on, Russians were gradually immersed in a monotonous reality. If you put a frog into boiling water, it will jump out. But what will happen if you put it in cold water and then slowly increase the temperature? Exactly, it will be cooked. This is what's happened with Russians. Journalists were gradually forced to change their point of view, and those who did not compromise were silenced, fled the country, or were killed. Russian propaganda dramatically increased during and after the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity in the winter of 2013-14, also known as the Maidan Revolution, as well as during Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. Media channels and news organisations participated in large-scale misinformation that played on people's fears, desires and insecurities. This ultimately reached a peak in the early days of the war in 2022, where the few remaining independent media outlets were forced to close their doors in Russia. Putin's regime introduced tough censorship measures, introducing laws that ban the media for distributing so-called knowingly false information about the war, or as they call it, the special military operation. These laws also apply to the average person posting on social media or taking part in any kind of protest. In August 2022, it was reported that since the beginning of the war, 138,000 websites had been blocked by officials. This propaganda has led to a lack of access to accurate and unbiased information, as well as actively exposing people to disinformation, and is one reason that so many Russians are either supportive of or apathetic towards the war. But of course, in 2022, many people have access to the internet, and there are ways of accessing unbiased media that is outside the control of Putin's regime. So the role of propaganda clearly isn't the only thing that explains the high levels of support for the war in Russia. A second factor is the oppression and persecution faced by those who do oppose the war. When Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022, protests broke out across Russia and were met with brutal response from the government. According to OVD Info, an independent human rights media project, within the first few weeks, almost 15,000 people were detained. So, what are the consequences of opposing the state and this war today? Let's see some examples. For organising or participating in a protest, you can get up to 15 years in prison. For public dissemination of knowingly false information about the use of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, you can get up to 15 years in prison. A criminal case against you can be started for posting, sharing, reposting or liking so-called extremist content. If you receive support from or are under the influence of other countries or overseas organisations, you or your organisation can be branded a foreign agent and can no longer receive public funding, organise public events, run for public office, work for organisations that distribute information, or have a government job such as teaching or policing. Any hefty fines that you might receive for these activities allow authorities to overdraft your bank account by thousands of rubles and have your assets seized. Riot police is heavily equipped and excessive force is used to deal with both crowds and singular protesters. And finally, there are many reports of torture and other physical abuse happening in Russian jails and prisons. Overall, it's impossible to say how many Russians are active supporters or opponents of this war. The Russian government has destroyed any kind of independent sociology research which measures public opinion, and the international climate makes it difficult for external researchers to carry out these types of survey. In addition, are the legions of bots on both Russian and English-speaking social media spreading the impression that the overwhelming majority of Russians support the war. Bots give the impression that more people support the war than actually do, but they also contribute to the dissemination of pro-war talking points, leading to more people actually holding pro-war views. Of course, there are multiple opinions that Russians hold about the war. We've outlined two of the most important factors that can make it seem like the majority of Russians either support it or are indifferent to it. If you're interested in Russian opposition and want to learn more about the context of what's happening in Russia, look out for future videos from the Russian Democratic Society. We'll be looking at the historical, psychological and social factors that provide a wider look at Russian support for the war, as well as covering in more detail the efforts of those involved in opposition to Putin's regime, all from a straightforward, facts-based perspective. Thanks for watching.